All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving in to something that's super important in our digital lives.
Yeah.
Database, backup, and recovery.
Yeah, it's kind of like that safety net,
Yeah,
for all that precious data we have.
exactly. Because losing data, man, that can be a huge blow, whether you're running a business or just, working on personal projects.
Absolutely. And it's something that, honestly, I think a lot of people don't really think about until it's too late.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So we're here to, help everyone understand how to protect themselves
Mhm.
and avoid that whole nightmare.
Right, because it's not just about the techie stuff. This is about making sure that the information that matters to you, it's going to be there for you when you need it.
Exactly. So, in this deep dive, we're going to kind of unpack all of this, like why backing up your data is so important.
Yeah, it's definitely not optional.
Nope. And we'll look at the different ways you can do it too, because, there are a bunch of different approaches.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And they each have their own, strategic advantages.
Yeah. All right. And we'll talk about some strategies for, actually making sure those backups are solid and they work when you need them.
Because what's the point of having backups if they don't work when you need them?
Exactly. And then we'll demystify that whole recovery process too, because I know that can seem kind of scary for some people.
Yeah, it can definitely feel intimidating, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll even take a look at some of the tools, that be used behind the scenes.
Uh-huh. And see how this all kind of comes together in real life situations.
Yeah. The goal is to give everyone a clear understanding of how to protect uh, their data, without feeling like they need a computer science degree to do it.
Right. So let's start with the foundation here. Like, why are backup and recovery so important?
Okay, so the fundamentals.
Yeah. It all boils down to making sure your data is protected and available, right? I
Yeah.
mean, think about it. Data loss, it can happen because of your hardware failed.
No, right. A hard drive crashes or something.
Exactly. Or you can have software issues or even just human error. And those things happen more often than you think.
More than we'd like to admit, maybe.
Definitely. And backups are like your first line of defense against all that.
Yeah. And it's not just about those like accidental things either.
Hmm.
You have to think about business continuity too, right?
Right, for sure. If something goes wrong and you lose data, you got to be able to get back up and running quickly.
Right. A good recovery plan is it's crucial for minimizing downtime.
Absolutely. And that downtime can cost you money, right?
Yeah.
Especially for businesses where data is their lifeline.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because this whole idea of needing backups, it
Yeah.
goes beyond just avoiding disaster. Right.
Right, right. There are regulations in a lot of industries about keeping data and being able to restore it.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So for a lot of organizations, regular backups aren't just a good practice, they're legally required.
Yeah, they have to do it. It's not even a choice. It makes me think that a solid backup and recovery plan is almost like an insurance policy for your data.
That's a really good analogy.
You hope you never have to use it,
Right.
but if you do, you're going to be so glad you have it.
Absolutely. So we talked about why it's so important.
Right.
Now let's look at the different ways you can actually back up your data.
Okay, the methods.
Yeah. And there are a few main ones,
Okay.
and each one has its own pros and cons.
Trade-offs.
Yeah, exactly. So understanding the options is really important. You got to choose the right approach for your needs.
Right. So let's start with the simplest one, I guess. The full backup.
Okay, the full backup. Yeah, that's the most straightforward one. It's just a complete copy of your entire database.
Like a snapshot, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like everything all at once. And for those of you who manage databases directly, like in SQL Server, you would do a full backup with a command, something like this. Backup database, my database to disk on SQL. Backups my database, full.back.
Okay.
But while it gives you that complete safety net, it can take a while.
Right, and it can take up a lot of space too.
Oh, yeah, especially if you have a large database.
So then you have incremental backups, right?
Right, incremental backups. Those are designed to be more efficient. Instead of copying everything, you only back up the changes that have been made since the last backup.
Oh, okay. So if you did a full backup on Monday,
Right.
an incremental backup on Tuesday would only save the stuff that changed between Monday and Tuesday.
Exactly. And that saves you time and space, right? Both during the backup and for storage.
Right. So it's kind of like a smarter way to do it.
Yeah, it's a bit more clever. And in SQL Server, you usually do an incremental backup using something called a differential backup. And the command for that looks something like this. Backup database, my database to disk, C. backups in manabase incremental.big with differential.
Okay.
And that differential backup, it basically captures all the changes since the last full backup,
Oh, okay.
which can make recovery a bit easier compared to a chain of purely incremental backups.
Gotcha. And then there's transaction log backups, right?
Oh, right, transaction log backups. Now we're getting into the really detailed stuff. These backups, they record every single transaction.
Every change.
Every change. Like, imagine a logbook that keeps track of everything that happens in your database. That's essentially what a transaction log backup does.
Wow. So that's like super granular.
Oh, yeah, super granular. And the cool thing is, you can use it to replay the history of your database up to a specific moment. So, you minimize data loss. You only lose what happened since the last transaction that was saved. And to do a transaction log backup in SQL Server, you'd use a command that looks like this. Backup log my database to disk in DLC backups my database log.trn.
Okay. So
Yeah.
it sounds like the best approach is to not just rely on one of these backup types, right?
Well,
You want to combine them.
Exactly. You want to use a combination.
What's a layered approach?
Yeah, exactly. And a very common strategy, which is like highly recommended, is to do regular full backups, like maybe once a week.
Okay.
And then, supplement those with more frequent incremental backups or transaction log backups.
Okay. So like daily or even hourly,
Okay.
depending on, how critical your data is.
Exactly. So you get that balance between having a complete picture with the full backup and then the efficiency and that granular recovery with the incremental and transaction log backups.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So now we understand like the different types of backups and why they're important. So let's talk about putting together a good strategy, like how to make a reliable backup plan that will actually work when you need it.
Yeah, that's the key, right? Because creating the backups is one thing, but you need to know they're going to be there and that you can use them when something bad happens.
Right. So I've heard a lot about the 3-2-1 rule. Can you explain what that is and why it's important?
Oh, yeah, the 3-2-1 rule, that's like a fundamental guideline. It's pretty simple. You should aim to have at least 3 copies of your important data.
Okay, 3 copies.
Yeah. So 1 copy is your primary data, like what you're working with right now.
Okay.
And the other 2 are backups. And these backups, they should be stored on 2 different types of storage media.
Okay, different types. So like what kind of things?
Like you could have an internal hard drive, an external hard drive, cloud storage.
Right, like back it up to the cloud.
Exactly. Or even like physical media, like tapes. And then the last part of the rule is that you should keep at least 1 copy offsite.
Oh, okay. So not in the same physical location as your primary data.
Exactly. So if, like, your computer crashes, you have a local backup.
Right.
But if something really bad happens, like, I don't know, a fire or a flood, your offsite backup is safe.
That makes a lot of sense.
The 3-2-1 rule is all about being prepared for different types of failures. It could be a problem with your hardware or the storage or even like a big disaster.
Right. It's about having those layers of protection. So another important thing, I think, is automation, right?
Yeah, automation is huge.
Because let's be honest, if you're relying on someone to remember to do backups manually,
Yeah.
that's probably not going to be very reliable.
No, not at all. Human error is like a big reason why data gets lost.
Right.
So you want to automate it. Make sure those backups are happening regularly without anyone having to remember.
So set it and forget it.
Exactly. For example, if you're using a MySQL database, you could schedule a command to run every day, like this. MySQL dump, root, make-p, mecu, backups, your database. Date plus % of bet SQL. You can use your operating system scheduling tools to do that.
Okay. And that'll just run in the background, take care of everything. But, even if you have backups in place,
Right.
you're not done.
Right. There's one more super important thing. You got to test your backups.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense. You got to make sure they actually work.
Exactly. Creating the backup is only half the battle.
Yeah.
You need to try restoring from those backups, every once in a while.
Right. To make sure they're not corrupted or anything.
Exactly. And to make sure you know how to do the recovery process. Because the worst time to find out your backup is messed up is when you desperately need it.
Yeah. That would be a nightmare.
So think of testing as like a fire drill for your data.
Okay. So we talked about how to create backups effectively.
Right.
Now let's talk about what happens if you actually need to use those backups, like the different ways to recover your data.
Okay, yeah. So the goal of data recovery is to get your database or your files back to a usable state after you've lost them. And the way you do it will depend on what kind of backup you have and, to what point in time you need to recover.
Right. So we talked about the different types of backups earlier.
Yeah,
So I guess the recovery process would be different depending on which type you're using.
Exactly.
So let's start with a full recovery.
Okay. With a full recovery, you're basically restoring your database to how it was when the last full backup was done.
Okay.
And if you're working with SQL Server, you might use a command like this. Restore your database from disk C. Backups your database full.bake.
Okay, so that's relatively straightforward.
Yeah, it's pretty simple if you just need to go back to the point of your last full backup.
But what if you lose data after that last full backup?
Right.
Then you need point-in-time recovery, right?
Exactly. That's where point-in-time recovery comes in.
Okay.
It lets you restore your database to a specific moment in time. And you usually do that by first restoring a full backup.
Okay.
And then you apply the transaction log backups up to the point where you need to go back to.
Oh, okay. So you're kind of like rolling it forward.
Yeah, exactly. You're rolling it forward. And in SQL Server, you often do that by restoring the full backup first, but you don't bring the database online right away.
Right.
You use this with no recovery option. Restore your database from disk. See backups your database full.bake with no recovery. Then you apply the transaction log backups and you tell it the exact time you want to recover to. Something like this. Restore log your database from disk. See backup your database log.trn with stop pat in 2023 1025 12.000000.
So you can be really precise with it.
Oh yeah, very precise.
Which is really helpful if, you know exactly when something went wrong.
Exactly. It lets you recover from things that happened at a specific moment without losing all the transactions that happened after that.
Right. So you're not like throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. What if you only need to recover like a small part of your database?
Oh, yeah. Like if you accidentally delete one table or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Do you have to restore everything?
Nope. You can do a partial recovery. That lets you restore specific objects from a backup, like individual tables.
Oh, okay. So you don't have to restore the whole thing.
Exactly. And in SQL Server, you would use a command like this. Restore table employees from disk C. Backups your database full.base. It can save you a lot of time if the data loss is only in one specific part of your database.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. This all shows that just having backups isn't enough.
Right. You have to know how to use them.
Exactly. You need to understand and practice these different recovery techniques so you're really prepared.
It's like you don't want to wait until you're in a crisis to figure out how to use the fire extinguisher.
Right, exactly. So we talked about what backup and recovery are and why they're important.
Right.
Now let's talk about the tools.
Okay. The tools of the trade.
Yeah, the actual things you'll use to do this stuff. And the tools, they often depend on what database system you're using.
Oh, okay. So like different systems have different tools.
Right, exactly. So for people using MySQL, a very common tool for creating what's called a logical backup is MySQL dump. A logical backup, it's basically like saving the instructions to rebuild your database.
Okay. So it's not like a straight copy of the data. It's more like a recipe.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Okay. And we saw an example of that earlier, right? When we were talking about scheduling backups.
Exactly. So a basic command for using MySQL dump to create a backup would look like this. MySQL dump dash your username up EP, your database name, pastour your backup your database.sql. This command, it takes the structure and the data of your MySQL database and turns them into a bunch of SQL statements, and then it saves those statements to a file.
Okay. And what about PostgreSQL? What do they use?
For PostgreSQL, the main tool is pgdump, and it works pretty similarly to MySQL dump in that it also creates logical backups. A basic example would look like this. pgdump -uu, your username, your database name, path to your backup, your database.sql.
Okay. And for SQL Server, we talked about some of the tsql commands already. Are there other tools that people use for that?
Yeah, for SQL Server, a lot of people use SQL Server Management Studio, or SSMS for short. It's a graphical interface, so it makes it easier to do a lot of database admin tasks.
Oh, okay. So it's a little more user-friendly.
Exactly. It's more visual. And of course, you can also just use the tsql commands directly, like backup database, your database to disk, backups your database.bake.
Okay. So it sounds like even though different database systems have their own tools, the basic principles of backups are the same, right?
Yeah, that's right. The key is to learn the tools that are specific for your system.
Okay.
And understand if they create logical backups, like those dump commands we talked about, or physical backups.
Right, which are those direct copies.
Exactly. Each approach has its own advantages and disadvantages.
Okay. So let's try to make all of this a little more concrete.
Okay.
Imagine you're running like a small online store.
Okay. An online store.
And you've got a MySQL database with all your customer and order data.
Right.
How would you go about protecting that data?
Okay. So for your online store, a good approach would be to combine regular full backups with more frequent backups of the changes. And since MySQL doesn't have transaction log backups like some other systems, we'll focus on full backups and then what we can kind of call incremental backups using the binary logs.
Okay, so it's a little different from SQL Server,
Yeah, a bit different.
but the same general idea.
Yeah.
So how would you set up those daily full backups for the online store?
You would use that MySQL command we talked about before and set up a scheduled task to run it every night.
Okay.
Something like this. MySQL dump P, your database name, backups online store, date plus pertempf dot SQL.
Okay.
That date part in the file name, that's just a way to automatically include the date so it's easy to keep track of your backups.
Oh, okay. So you know which backup is from which day. That makes sense. And what about those more frequent backups to capture the changes that happen during the day?
For that, you would use MySQL's binary logging. It basically keeps track of all the changes in your database. Okay.
And then you would periodically, like maybe every hour, flush those logs and archive them.
Okay.
The commands would look something like this. MySQLib, your username, PEFLU/log, MV varlib MySQLobin, MySQLobin 0001. Backups, binary logs MySQLobin, backups plus part of SQL SUC 0001.
Okay.
And keep in mind that that path to your binary logs might be different depending on how your server is set up.
Right. So now we've got those backups in place, but of course we need to make sure we can actually use them.
Right, we got to test it.
How would you do a basic recovery test for this online store database?
You would take one of your full backup files and you'd restore it to a different environment.
Okay.
That could be a completely different server or just a different database on the same server. We'd use the MySQL command line client to do that, something like this. MySQL your username, test database, backups online store 2023-1026.sql.
Okay.
That command would basically recreate the database as it was on that date, but in your test environment.
Okay, so you can see if it works without messing up your live data.
So that's how all of this stuff comes together in a real situation.
Right.
Pretty cool.
And this is the kind of stuff that businesses and people do every day to protect their data.
Makes you realize how important it is. Okay, so let's go over some of the key concepts and answer some common questions about backup and recovery, just to make sure everything's clear.
Sounds good. So first of all, backups are crucial for protecting your data from all sorts of things,
Right.
like hardware failures, accidental deletions, you name it.
And they help you get back up and running quickly if something bad happens.
Exactly.
And the main difference between a full backup and an incremental backup
Right.
is that a full backup copies everything,
Yeah,
while an incremental backup only saves the changes.
precisely.
And you can create a full backup in MySQL using that MySQL dump command.
Right. MySQL dump doc your username, meter A be the database name, backup your database.sql,
Yeah.
something like that.
Okay. And we talked about point-in-time recovery, too, which lets you go back to a specific moment in time.
Right. You usually use transaction logs for that.
Right. And then there's the 3-2-1 rule.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
3 copies of your data, 2 different types of media, and 1 copy offsite.
Exactly. A good rule of thumb.
And to restore a database in SQL Server, you'd use a command like restore your database from disk, cbackups your database.back.
Right. And transaction log backups, their main purpose is to make that point-in-time recovery possible.
Right, so you don't lose as much data.
Exactly. And to automate backups in PostgreSQL, you'd use pgdump along with the scheduling tool.
Okay. It's also important to know the difference between logical backups,
Right.
which are those SQL instructions,
Right.
and physical backups,
Right.
which are those direct copies of the files.
Exactly. They each have their own uses.
Okay. And of course, you always want to test your backups by actually restoring them in a test environment.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Can't stress that enough.
Make sure they actually work.
Yeah.
And that with no recovery option in SQL Server,
Right.
that's for keeping the database ready for you to apply those transaction log backups.
Yeah, it's for those point-in-time recoveries.
Okay.
And then partial recovery, that's if you only need to restore a specific part of your database.
Right.
Like one table or something.
Okay. So some best practices to remember are automate your backups, follow the 3-2-1 rule, and test your recovery process.
Right. Those are the big ones.
We also talked about encrypting your backups.
Oh, yeah. That's important for keeping sensitive information safe.
Right.
You can use tools like OpenSSL or features built into some databases for that.
Okay. And it's important to understand the difference between backing up your data, which is for disaster recovery, and archiving it, which is for long-term storage.
Right. They're different things with different purposes.
Okay. So let's do a couple of quick scenarios to make sure you've got all this down.
That's good.
First scenario. You need to schedule daily full backups for a MySQL database. What command would you use?
All right, so for that, you'd want to use mysqldump and schedule it to run every day. The command would look something like this. Mysqldump, your username, your database name, backups your database, date plus percent.
Okay.
I got it.
Now, second scenario.
Yeah.
You need to restore a SQL Server database to how it was just before something happened at 3:1:15 p.m. on November 10th, 2023.
Okay.
You have a full backup from the night before and transaction log backups running every hour.
All right.
What would you do?
Okay, so first, you would restore that full backup, but keep the database offline.
Okay.
You would use with no recovery for that. The command would be restore database, your database from disk, C, backups your database, full.bake with no recovery. Then you would apply the transaction log backups, but you would stop them at 3:15 p.m. on November 10th. So the command would look like this. Restore log your database from disk, C, backups your database log.tern with stoppat 2023 1110 15.15000, assuming, of course, that your transaction log backups are named in a way that includes the time.
Exactly. You nailed it. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into database backup and recovery. We covered a lot today.
We did, yeah.
We talked about why backups are so important, the different types of backups, different recovery methods, and some of the tools that get used.
Yeah, it's all about protecting your data and making sure you can get it back if something goes wrong.
Exactly.
And understanding this stuff, it's really important for anyone who works with data, whether it's for a big company or just for yourself.
Right. So, as a final thought, I want you to think about what data is most important to you.
Okay.
And then ask yourself, are your current backup strategies good enough?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Are you confident that you can get that data back if something happened?
It's definitely something to think about.
It is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.